It's interesting to note how two people coming together is the equivalent to two entities beginning the process of tuning each other. As soon as you see somebody, as soon as you hear somebody, whether they be behind you or out of sight, the process of tuning begins. And you could be in a room full of people and you hear one person speaking that cuts through all of the other people speaking. And for whatever reason, it is that particular person and their particular words that is grabbing your attention. The same can be said about our vision. There can be a room full of people, and as our eyes scan the room, there is one sight that seems to grab our attention. And even as the senses first make contact, you begin the most rudimentary form of tuning. I don't know if you've ever been in a staring contest, but it's interesting to note how much can be said without saying a word. If you've ever just, for the sake of interest or for the sake of play, just intentionally sat with somebody and didn't talk, it's pretty interesting to see what that's all about, and with some people, you're completely comfortable in silence. And that's not true with everybody. And that's kind of a strange thing if you think about it. Comfortable silence versus uncomfortable silence. It's almost like when you have uncomfortable silence, there's a slightly out of tune situation, and one is compelled to say or do something to tune things or adjust things just so that you may be able to rest in a comfortable silence. Or even in the situation of being around somebody, comfort itself is definitely tied to the sort of tuning that has taken place, or the anticipation of what sort of tuning may happen in the future, as supposed by what's happening now, because each person has their own specific frequency, which is sort of a common theme, but human beings aren't unlike their own radio stations in a way, or radios, or something that can be found on a certain frequency. And we're always turning dials, and when two people first come into contact, their frequencies are as they are, but as soon as people begin a relationship from the very start, it's like two separate and distinct frequencies, bearing in mind these frequencies are sort of a combined sum of all that we are, as represented by what we radiate, what we appear to radiate. There are things about us that we simply can't hide. We are, as they say, but it's also strange how there can be a situation where two people meet and it feels like they've known each other for years. Or there's this odd sense of familiarity and you just sort of click. And that's going to be two people who have as much of their background, much of their life so far, similar frequencies, similar ways of understanding things. These people are going to be quite comfortable with each other, and even more. It's more than comfort, because let's be honest, I mean, we as people are always trying to figure out what's going on, whether that be with our relationships or the world at large or our country or our job. We're always trying to figure out what's happening. And there's a certain higher level of beauty when we come across somebody who we're more than comfortable with. We actually feel lit up or sparked or inspired by. I mean, there are some people who, upon meeting them, makes us simply want to be better, which is pretty wild if you think about it, without them even having to say anything like that at all. Not a word about it. Their existence makes us want to do things that make us better. And that's not a very common thing, but it absolutely does happen. And that's a pretty rare scenario. That's when their particular frequency exists in a way that just harmonizes with our own. And the sort of tuning that takes place turns both people into something different and better. It's like having a guitar or a piano or any instrument who has sets of chords that, when brought together, have a beautiful and harmonic sound. And those sounds can't be found in just any grouping or any cluster of notes. The guitar has to be tuned properly, and you have to hit certain notes to get a certain sound, and then you bring those sounds together across time in a pattern to form a song, something beautiful. And two people can kind of do that. They sort of become this song, And a song is something that is pulled out of reality. It's pulled out of the world. It's something that isn't there and then is. And quite often, more often than not, actually, there is a neutral effect when we meet people, and then there's the opposite, where it's like a recoil, where it's like just hitting any old notes on the guitar in any old order, and you just want to stop playing because it's not a song. And we always tune each other, always. And overall, our intelligence is the composer. Our intelligence is this powerful observer that has the ability to notice patterns in ourselves and in other people and in the world and tether them together cohesively. Intelligence is one of the most important, if not the most important thing that we can have. And in this age, we have access to so much information. We can learn so much about the world, so much about ourselves, that there isn't any solid reason to not know quite a bit about the world. And things that seem completely unrelated have tethers and do quite well to form a strong, sensible, and even brilliant worldview. And it all contributes to our general sense of charge when we have ideas, because ideas carry a charge. And the quality of the charge is in part determined by how much it corresponds with the truth. If you have an idea, that's great, but it is made all the better when it corresponds with the truth. When you get those two things linked up, you have something. And usually ideas stay dormant until there's some sort of palpable correspondence with the truth. And this is a tuning. That this tunes both of those things. The idea corresponds with the truth, and the truth and the idea can become something greater when tethered together, put into action, acted upon, spoke of, and enter the world. For example, an idea of a story. An idea of a story can become quite a great thing when the story is actually written. And it's one of those situations where you end up sort of creating the truth yourself, because the story didn't exist before you. And after you've made it, it's now the truth in the fact that it exists, which is the most rudimentary form, the most elementary form that we have, is our comprehension of reality and all of its tunes, and representing it in words. And wisdom is going to be the composition so far. It's the composer and the composition. What you've done so far to date. This is why wisdom usually grows with age, because it is a series of compositions tethered together. It creates an overall tune in and of itself. And it's, as I said, we do this whether we're conscious of it or not. And if you look inside of yourself, for every person that you know, every person that you've ever met, if you think of them right now, think of their being, them as a person as you know them, each person feels different. Each person carries their own charge. And each person that we know is both them as an individual plus them so far as we have tuned each other. And that's completely what the relationship is. The relationship is this tune that you've made with that person. And it's pretty miraculous how quickly, instantaneously, we can feel these things with people. And on top of that, the world is a series of tunes. And there is 1,000 different ways to say a true thing. And it is so much better to say the truth a certain way over lying. It's always far better, because a lie is just putting a distortion out there that you're going to have to deal with eventually and untangle. And some lies are small and the tangle that they create stays relatively small, and some can build and gather momentum like a black hole until it becomes part of reality in a way. And at that point, untangling it is almost insurmountable. It's almost become a thing of its own. It's always so much better to say the truth a certain way. And when I say a certain way, I don't mean there is some exact wording that's required. I mean, there's always a way to say something that negates the negative. And some people are very, very good at this. Some people are very, very good at telling the truth. And there's no more gratifying thing than getting it right. And not just getting it right, but getting it right in a way that is artful. And a line of succession, a momentum built on that is highly energetic. It's full of tethers and life and energy that has minimal distortions. You rarely get that thump in your chest when you realize there's a distortion somewhere that you have to deal with. Like you have a clean landscape, as clean as it can be, and your threads of momentum are in tune, that they're properly harmonized. It's always better, like I can't stress this enough, to tell the truth and get good at speaking on reality and being properly tuned into the person you're telling the truth to, because that matters too. And it's interesting how over time we start to notice some universals, that there are some universal tunes that are non-specific to anybody in particular that seem to apply to all of us. And these things end up becoming crystallized as principles. A principle is a small set of words that, so far as we know, so far as we see, and to the best of our knowledge, corresponds to what is best. Through maybe multiple civilizations, multiple lives, multiple experiences of your own, you can summarize what has transpired in a few small words that ends up being a principle that makes it much easier to navigate in life if you know them. And a good example of that is, do unto others as you would have done unto you. And we all know that one. But when you hear it, there's this kind of resonance. There's a clear tuning effect that may already exist within us. We may have already been tuned to that. So when you hear it, it's just a reminder. It doesn't have that quick, radical tuning effect. But the second part of that is the application in the world. If you hadn't heard that before and it's stuck, and you went out into the world living that way, you would say, okay, this tuned me properly, and I'm able to use it to tune other people as well. And it may lead to you getting burned, And there are other ones. There are many, actually. But that's what a principle is. It is a finely tuned and synthesized set of words that corresponds to the truth so far and as best as we know it, summarized in just a few words. And civilizations are wise to collect those, and we do. We can't really help it. I mean, these are like basic pillars. But on the other end, we can't really help but fall out of tune too, sometimes. Because sometimes the world and people do things and say things, and things transpire that, I guess you could say, rock our faith and begin to start making blows at our worldview. But this is why intelligence is so important, plus wisdom. If you have something that has worked out for a long time, and then one time it doesn't, you don't just suddenly take that on as a belief that this thing suddenly isn't true anymore. You're able to see the nuance of the situation that led to the events as they unfolded. And a romantic relationship is also a tuning. And the most compatible people are people who like the effect that they have on each other. And those people are going to sort of buzz. They're going to have a hum to them. And such people notice things about each other. If you truly love somebody and you're truly in tune with them, you are very good at anticipating them. You understand them probably more than anybody, maybe outside of their own parents or family members. And there's that situation where many things don't even really need to be said, so long as you comprehend them and understand them and speak on them or act on them. If you understand things about somebody and you have that anticipatory sense and you don't act on them, then you're going to start letting in distortions because you see it, you understand it, but for whatever reason, you don't do anything about it. That's when things slowly start to fall out of tune because the other person can reasonably assume that you're out of sync. And you might even put it that way, that for whatever reason you're out of tune, and you might also, people tend to do this, reasonably assume that maybe your tuning is somewhere else. Maybe you're starting to tune up in a different direction and fall out of sync with that person. And this is why people notice problems before there actually is a problem. Because they start to just get sort of a feeling that something is off. And they would be right. And this is why people complain and argue about very, very petty things, because they are things that a person once acted on and spoke on because they noticed, because they're so in tune, and now they're not. And in that situation, it is reasonable to theorize that they're falling out of sync, and that's why people will ask, is there someone else? Because we're always tuning each other. If we're falling out of tune with somebody, we're tuning somewhere else, some way, somehow, whether we know it or not. And a marriage is supposed to be the place where two people so deeply tune together that they, yes, do remain their individual selves, but they also become their own harmony. They become their own distinct thing. And it's almost like in Ghostbusters where you combine the beams, where the effect of your coupled tuning is so much more potent, and it's more than just two people. Like I know mathematically it's 1 + 1 = 2, but the psychic and emotional effect of two people in tune like that and bound like that, it's just more than two people. I know it sounds strange to say, but it's much more potent than that, because the etching that is created, the path that's made, affects so many more lives by the existence of it. And it's a really powerful thing to get that right. And when you go through things with each other and life hands out these situations that are hard, and during the process of tuning in a more deep way, when you come across asymmetries and incongruencies, if you love each other enough to figure out how to get those tuned up, the bond will go deeper than one could even have conceived prior. And it becomes a much, much stronger force with the two of you. And such a bond and such a tuning, taken all the way through a life, all the way to our end, having experienced all of these things, is such a strong bond. By the end, you're basically the same person. Like, if you make it to your 80s and you've been married for 50 years, you two are so tightly bound that you're one and the same force. You're, yes, two separate individuals, but I mean, at that point, you're basically one thing, and I'm sure those of us who knew our grandparents who were together like that and stayed together like that, it's the sort of thing that just, it's just so powerful, and a lot of the time when we come into this world and we meet our parents are usually at some of the more difficult phases of that tuning. They're 10 or 15 years in, and that's probably the hardest point. That's when the tuning is trying to become so powerful that it is truly unconditional. And everything up until that point isn't there yet. And this is a multi-year process, especially depending on who you are and the nature of both individuals. For some it's quicker, for some it's slower, for some it never happens and never gets that far. And we start to lock into other people, and we start to fall out of sync, out of tune with the harmony of the marriage, with the whole charge of the original idea of the family, of the building. All of that slowly starts to fall out of sync, usually somewhere in that time frame. But for those who are meant to make it all the way, do. And that's because they existed as individuals a certain way, and they came together a certain way, they clicked a certain way, and the effect on each other was true. And they managed to correspond with the truth more often than not. And when they didn't, they knew how to rectify it and turn it into the truth. Because, as I've said, current unfolding events are linked to the past, obviously, and have a continuous altering effect on the meaning of the past. And a relationship is always growing. Two people who are like this, even if you're apart, it's always growing in some way. It almost doesn't have a negative side in that way. It's always growing, but you could perceive negative aspects and positive aspects, of course. But on the whole, such a relationship is always growing, even in hard times, even through difficulty. And that's just, it's some of the more interesting things to notice and think about us. About how even ideas have a charge. And it's like I've said in the past, genius has the ability to connect and link seemingly unrelated ideas into what one may call a whole, finished idea, ready to be put out into the world, ready to be talked about. And it's interesting how a nation is also a tune. A nation tunes itself against other nations, similar to how people tune each other. And this day and age, it's a whole lot easier to notice and understand and interact with the tune of the nation because of things like social media. But at the same time, social media offers distortions on a much larger scale. A long time ago, what we mostly had was headlines and news outlets, and that was the primary source. And it kept us relatively on a singular line. And that's true with culture formation through the arts and entertainment. But we are the generation who is figuring social media out, and it offers exposure to far, far more, as well as this phenomena where the human shadow is far more inclined to make itself available on social media. We are far more likely to say things and do things even that are definitely within what one would consider the shadow. And there are some people who are, as part of their mission, dedicated to being such an actor. But even with that, as it is part of the picture of the truth, we are dealing with a much more vast array of the truth. And it shifts the human condition quite a bit. The full effects we are yet unaware of, but they are certainly there. People have access to each other on a much, much larger scale, people that we otherwise would have had no contact with. But even on social media, communication with a person, if it is extensive enough, you can become quite tuned. And if you pay attention, you can get so much of a picture of a place that it can be summarized in a sense, in a feeling. You know, if you're aware of the politics and the inclinations and the words and the beliefs of a people, even through social media as one of the avenues, you can get a real feeling for a place. And at the same time, it offers an avenue for people to display the perceived finest version of themselves. So much so, the truth becomes an article of faith. Because when somebody says something about their experience, you have to take it on faith that that actually happened in a different way than you would if they were sitting right in front of you, because we have involuntary ways of surrendering what we are and what's happening with us in person than we do, obviously, just through social media. And that has effects too. What I always do, there's the world of social media, but there is also my day-to-day experience. And you have to, in my opinion, juxtapose those two things to get a full picture of what's happening. If you live in a country and spend quite a bit of time on social media reading about your country and the experiences of the people in your country, you should juxtapose that with your day-to-day experience too. It shouldn't just be one or the other. It has to be those two to get a true sense. And sometimes it can be quite easy to assume one of those two things is whole and complete and adequate in and of itself, which can lead to quite large imbalances, especially on the social media end of things, because there's such a multitude of people. It can be easy to assume that they're all truthful, because if they're all saying similar things, what are the odds that it's untrue? But it's also important to recognize fashions. People will select a version of what's true and word a version of what's true and interpret in their day-to-day lives a version of what's true that corresponds to what is currently fashionable. Because there's a direct line between the things that we say and the response we get, which is a form of tuning, that may give us the idea that certain fashions are what we should be looking for. And some of this stuff can have pretty serious ramifications. There have been people who have said things that are completely untrue, and it's led to more people repeating it and then projecting it into their own day-to-day world and seeming to get feedback that corresponds with that. It's almost like casting illusions in a far more potent way. And then they'll go back to social media and say, yes, I've seen the same thing. And it goes and goes. But these things appear to me more as fashions than the truth. It's almost like that situation where you have this idea and then write it down, and then it sort of becomes true by the existence of now these words here. But if you write things down on paper, it exists there. If you write things down on the internet and hit send, it exists somewhere else, somewhere that can have a tuning effect. And this can go off onto threads that are complete fabrications. As strange as it sounds, it has a tuning effect on how we actually interpret our day-to-day experience, the actual sense and feeling we have on a day-to-day level. And it takes real wisdom to know the difference. And like I said, intelligence is the composer. It takes real intelligence too to properly decipher these things. Because all it takes is one very well-renowned and respected economist to say, pull all of your money out of X because by all indications it's getting ready to fall for a bank run. It's that easy, which can have ramifications, and by the time those things unfold, tracing it back to the source isn't even really a consideration, because in a strange way, that triggering effect, that initial tuning, ended up bringing about the very effect that was forecast. It could be completely untrue, but all sorts of people in all sorts of positions say all sorts of things, and people are aware of their position, and they're aware that saying things will affect people. And this is that shadow coming out where a person understands and realizes that they have some sort of power now, power that they otherwise would have never had. And you can sort of make things out of thin air. And it's important to be able to identify such a person for your own intellectual and social abilities and say, that person wasn't telling the truth and you shouldn't trust them in the future until they, redeem themselves. It's like we can say anything, yes, of course. Freedom of speech is a beautiful thing, but it has social cost. For we are entities that act and react. And when we meet people and we're around people and we're introduced to people, sometimes we fall in love, in a real way. And the sort of tuning effect that has is something that is quite unique and distinct for both parties. And both parties enjoy it quite thoroughly. But it's interesting to see how this all unfolds, especially in the social media age. I honestly have a certain respect for people who are able to be, respectable, even when they don't have to be. Because I notice a lot of the time when people give responses to certain statements, innocuous statements, intellectual statements, statements that are attempting to assert fact, I've noticed those responses can be unnecessarily shadow-esque. People resort to name-calling and having this air about them that is clearly trying to display some sort of superiority by correcting them and the way they go about it. And I have a certain respect for somebody who is able to resist their shadow on a place that has no real cost or no real gain for doing so. Because it says something. It says something about people who are able to be more refined with their knowledge when they correct people or, quote unquote, educate people or give statements that refute other statements. I mean, it doesn't sound like it has a large effect, but it does. I mean, for many, the world of social media is a huge chunk, if not most, of their social interaction, and it can create an image of humanity that is not actually the case, because we all know that a lot of the time people say things that they would never say in person. They just wouldn't. And they go about themselves in a way that they would never do in person. But the fact that a person is willing to behave that way because they can says something about their wisdom. It says something about their tune. And it adds distortions. But it's almost like people have found this place of relatively rudimentary power and just got their hands on the scepter or the wand or the staff, and they're using it to, roast frogs or, they're using the dark side of it and finding out how that plays out, how it makes them feel, what sort of effect it has on themselves. Because to say it has no effect would be incorrect. It takes more of you, more goodness of you to remain decent in a place where you don't have to be. And I think in time, more and more people are going to see it that way. I mean, whether we think so or not, it does have an effect.